the introduction, it is grounded in the memory of a family that was forced to cross the Atlantic in the course of the Jewish exodus of the 20th century. All of that comes together in a new and a vibrant understanding of migration and of the diasporic condition. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope I prepared you for some level of tightrope walking, and I hope that you're sure-footed, have no fear of heights. Please join me in welcoming Professor Steinberg. The floor is yours, Michael.
I'll try to stay close to the microphone also for the benefit of people online. So please let me know if I stray or wander and become inaudible. I'm very happy to follow those instructions. Well, let me thank first Susan for the very generous invitation. I've been in this room for many interesting events. I've never been in this position before, so I'm somewhat intimidated, but very grateful for the invitation, and clearly to Daniel for that somewhat embarrassing introduction, which does make me a bit uncomfortable. So I'll remain standing for the rest of the talk. As Daniel mentioned, I was a fellow for a short period of 2015 and 16 at the Vico, and then back in 2020 when I saw almost nobody for the 2 months that we were back, but saw a lot of people on screen. But during the last week, Daniel, as you'll remember, the last week of the short rebirth of restaurants in Berlin, you and I went out to lunch somewhere in mid-October of 2020. And I have to say it felt so transgressive to go into a restaurant that I felt that you and I were somehow characters in a late 19th century French novel making our required trip to a local bordello and then not being able to tell anybody about it afterwards. So it has a very, I don't remember what we ate, but it was a unique experience in the fall of 2020. So what I'd like to do this evening, briefly, because I always enjoy discussions more than hearing myself speak, is a talk in 3 parts. I would like to talk briefly about this book that has already been mentioned, which is a composite, I hope a coherent one, of different approaches to a single theme. I'd like then, with the help of a few images, to mention a couple of key principles that I think that I hope the book tries to isolate. And then finally, with your indulgence, I'd like to point the way, at least, to the continuation of the argument. I thought of this book as a project in 2 parts, and I'm just beginning to think of part 2. So I always have the habit of speaking about things too early, but that means that there's feedback and help in building topics, which is always more rewarding than talking about something that is already somewhat finished. So in terms of timing, this is my COVID book, since it came out in just last summer. But I didn't conceive of it as a COVID book. I did conceive of it as how to think our way out of the Trump era book. So as you all know, Donald Trump was inaugurated in January of 2017. And in August of that same year, August of 2017, there was an event in Charlottesville, Virginia, which has since been referred to many times as Charlottesville 2017, in which a mob of white supremacists stormed the city chanting both racist and anti-Semitic remarks. And the next day, as President of the United States, Donald Trump said that there were decent people on both sides of the argument, which for many of us was a moment that we felt would be very difficult to get out of, either nationally or even intellectually. In January of 2019, at the end of January, a real intellectual hero of mine, Yaron Ezrahi, an Israeli political scientist, died. in a moment of increasing melancholy about similar issues facing the state of Israel, which, as I think we can observe, have gotten more extreme and more scary just now in recent weeks. So thinking about Yaron Ezrahi, who spent really a long career putting together the philosophy and history of democracy, democratic thought, democratic institutions, with the history and philosophy of science, that was his composite, in the context of the overall situation, I felt somehow driven to write something that was at once historical but also very presentist, and a kind of comment on how some of these basic issues about how to think about democracy impacted the United States, Europe to a great extent, and also Israel. So the question is, in its basic principle, how to think historically and philosophically about democracy as a term that is essentially fragile, that has no real definition, that has no abstract life of its own, that is infinitely contextualized, and as a political way of being, infinitely fragile. So on the one hand, we think of the crisis of democracy these days. It seems to me a perfectly valid way to start a conversation. On the other hand, I think it's equally valid to suggest that democracy has always been in crisis, partly because it is politically fragile, but also because it's epistemologically or scientifically fragile. We know what the word means. We know it means the power of the people, but we don't know what the people means. And one reason I'm a historian is so that I can argue that, in fact, what the people means is something radically different from century to century, from national tradition to national tradition. So when I began to think about Moses, it occurred to me that the figure of Moses is, to be slightly crass, an historically useless figure. He's somebody that everybody knows. He's a figure of great importance. As my archaeologist spouse reminds me, there is no evidence that any such figure ever existed historically. When I gave a 10-minute version of this talk to students at my university a year ago, apparently there were several students, Orthodox Jewish students, who covered their heads when I suggested that, in fact, there's no evidence of any historical existence. So that's another issue. But there's no evidence of any historical figure. The structure of his life, of the life of Moses, which is a function of storytelling, is parallel to multiple mythological stories of figures of unknown origins that are found and then become leaders under some kind of curse. This is a mythologically extremely varied and very broad story, but historically useless in the sense of not being useful as a political icon for the foundation of any kind of nation or political system. Another Israeli scholar reminded me that in Israel today there are no streets and no locations of any significance named after Moses. King David is everywhere, Moses is nowhere. And whether this is a conscious observation is more difficult to say, but functionally it shows what I'm calling somewhat crassly the historical uselessness of the figure. If you think of the story of Moses in a biographical sense, the origin is on the one hand fairly typical, but it is inarticulate in terms of who Moses is, where he comes from, how the Egyptian Moses relates to the savior of the Israelites, etc. And more unusually, if you think of the end of the life, there is also no end of the life. There is the mythological prohibition to enter the promised land. There are various theories, including Sigmund Freud's, which I'll get back to in a minute, that talk about Moses having been murdered by the next generation. What the historian Lynn Hunt, in a brilliant book about the French Revolution, called the Band of Brothers, in other words, the second generation that is unable to replace the father figure. In the case of the French Revolution, the beheaded King of France. In the case of Moses, the leader of the people in the emergence from slavery. So there is no trajectory of a beginning or end, no origin, no telos. What there is a witnessing of the granting of law, and the law is granted to a political community that is not a national community. It's a granting of a universal law to a group of people who then become a group, and that group, as we know, has various historical labels and identities from its first occurrence centuries later as the Jews, and then in modern times as the citizens of the state of Israel. So the modern reception of this story is extremely rich and broad and varied. Very difficult to tell. I don't really attempt to do that. But the position in the 20th century where the story is retold with the most intense existential pressure is, from my point of view, the last book of Sigmund Freud, Der Mann Moses, or Moses and Monotheism in the English translation, a book that Freud wrote in two parts, unpublished at his death in 1939, begun in Vienna in 1936. A book that he wrote with, even for him, he always wrote with anxiety, but a book that he wrote with particular anxiety, and he called it an historical novel, in a way, withdrawing the claim of science or history or archaeology, and had a great deal of discomfort about its publication. The last part was written in exile in London, as I said, not published until after his death. And the reason, other than the scientific wobbliness of the book, was his fear that, to quote him, not word for word, in the period of the greatest danger of the Jews, he was taking their great hero away from them. That Freud was taking Moses away from the Jews by claiming empirically, based on a great deal of literature that he read, which he reproduces in the book, that Moses was in fact an Egyptian, that he was not a Hebrew found as a baby in the river. This is a typical story, but that he was in fact an Egyptian, a renegade Egyptian priest from a monotheistic cult who then founded Moses and monotheism. From my point of view, it's not necessarily interesting whether Moses really was X or Y, but the fact that he isn't anything, that his origin is not part of the story. And the fact that the origin is not part of the story is part of the political uselessness in terms of ideology, the ideological uselessness of the figure. In the terms that Edward Said made well known in his early work, it is a story of beginnings, but not a story of origin. That beginnings are functions of history and the actions of human beings and secular politics, and origins are the precinct of mythology, an ahistorical point of view with myths of return. When Freud wrote his last book on Moses, he was not addressing this figure for the first time. So this is the mid to late 1930s. In 1914, as many of you will know, Freud wrote a really marvelous, much shorter piece, an essay called The Moses of Michelangelo, which I dare to reproduce for you here. Not Freud's essay, but the actual image. And I'd like to say something about Freud's reading of this image. He starts out by saying that every time he went to Rome, when he got over his so-called Rome neurosis, that he made a point of climbing the stairs from the Via Cavour, which was very busy, to the abandoned square where he would somehow, with embarrassment, walk through the gates and stare at this particular statue, and that he would stare at it with a feeling of personal guilt as if he were being accused of being a member of the mob that Moses has to confront when Moses comes down from his famous interview on Mount Sinai. And then Freud, this is 1914, with a great deal of almost school student rigor, proving his point, hiring an artist to help him prove his point, he tries to make an original argument about what is going on in this statue. And he says that on the one hand, there's a conventional reading. In the conventional reading, Moses, as you can see, has the two tablets of the law under his right arm. He has been sitting down on his way down from the mountain. And as he is hearing the noise of the people, right, der Lärm des Volkes in Freud's writing, he is enraged by what he understands is going on in the plains. In other words, the return to idolatry, the return to the political decadence of slavery, the worship of the golden calf. And he's about to get up in his rage, which is the story we know, smash the tablets and enact revenge on the idolaters below. And Freud makes this argument through the position of the body, through the tension of the hands. The right hand is not only covering the tablets, which he's doing so, Moses is doing so carelessly that they may almost fall from his grasp. His right hand is clutching his beard in tension. The left hand is clutching a garment. The two legs are not symmetrical. They're clearly not in a state either of repose or of ambulation, and therefore the conventional reading says this is when Moses gets up in his rage. Freud says actually the opposite is taking place, that Freud decides against his instincts to remain seated, and that the tension involves the decision to remain seated and find a kind of calm and reason and not, in fact, engage in an act of violence. So it's a critique of the intervention, the political intervention, as the act of violence. It seemed to me that there are important precedents for this kind of argument, in other words, iconographic precedents of well-known images. And one that comes to mind, there are many, is a great painting by Jacqueline David, the revolutionary French painter, the portrait of Brutus. This is Lucius Brutus, not Caesar's assassin. This is the early Republican Brutus, who is seated in the left half of, from our perspective, the left quadrant of the painting, with a body that is under a fair amount of torture and ambivalence. The upper part of the body is the position that he is showing to the people around him, a position of reason and moderation, and the lower half of the body, especially the intertwining of the two legs, is the emotional state that he is in, which he is trying not to reveal to the people around him, as the bodies of his two sons are brought into his home behind him. His two sons were involved in a restoration of the monarchy, and as a political figure, Brutus had to take the position for the execution of his own sons. And like many paintings of David, there's a gender divide between the right side of the painting and the left side, with the women of the house lamenting the private side of the painting in a way, lamenting the event that has taken place, and Brutus in the situation of intense ambivalence and contradiction, taking both sides of the argument. Now, to move slightly more unpredictably, this is maybe what Susan had in mind in your remarks about the unusualness of the argument.
That was very flat. I'm sorry. That I didn't say more.
An image that moves into the American context, which again you will recognize, the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C. to my surprise, even in a recent monograph devoted to this statue, there is no mention of the Michelangelo Moses as in any way related. But this seems to me a kind of obvious lack in seeing. I'm not sure about lack in scholarship, but certainly a lack in seeing. And that here is a leader of the people, often called Moses, as you know, because of the emancipation of the slaves in 1863, but in a seated position. And in a seated position of, again, significant ambiguity, a kind of asymmetry in the two legs, a significant tension in the two hands, the left hand clenched into a kind of fist, the right hand, fingers elongated, pointing to the seat of the armchair in which he is sitting. This statue was first thought of by a group of people in and outside of the US Congress in 1909 being the centennial of the birth of Lincoln. It took 13 years to be installed. It was installed in a ceremony in 1922. And the argument of the statue continues today to inhabit one side of the argument about the legacy of Lincoln, and that is the argument that Lincoln's politics involved the preservation of the Union. Lincoln's politics were about American unity. And it's clearly true that Lincoln's political statements, his public persona, involved the preservation of union and not the abolition of slavery, although there is strong evidence that Lincoln himself, as he said often in private company, abhorred the institution of slavery, but on moral grounds and not necessarily on political grounds. And if the ceremony that inaugurated the statue in 1922 still operated under Jim Crow laws of racial separation in the United States, so that black and white spectators in the very large crowd on the Mall at the inauguration were separated, with the black spectators far in the back and the white spectators in the front. There's an uncomfortable part of the iconography of the statue, which you may have noticed, and that the arms of this armchair, especially the one that Lincoln's right hand almost seems to be pointing to, are ornamented with the Roman fasces, right? The bundle either of sticks or rods that exactly in the year, and there's nothing more here, I think, than coincidence, but exactly in the year 1922, about 5 months after the inauguration of the statue, become almost universally and exclusively the symbol of Italian fascism. So the fasces, here's a more abstract rendering, are either an agricultural symbol, meaning sticks that come together to make a structure, or a more military political symbol that involve individual weapons being tied together by the authority represented by the axe. So for the makers of the Lincoln statue, one can certainly assume that the fasces as a Roman Republican symbol constituted the union of the United States, but in a way the takeover in the same year of the statue of the symbol as a symbol of a different kind of political unity, in other words, fascist unity, makes for a highly ambivalent iconography in this kind of work. And this becomes a phrase that I would experiment with in a much more general way, and that is that the iconography of democracy is in fact the iconography of ambivalence. That there is enormous ambivalence between where authority is located in a system of democracy. Is it a strong central authority? Is it a decentralized authority? And what it does amount to is this almost infinite variety in what is meant by the authority of the people. What are the prices, the costs of unity in terms of the life of actual people? And let me move to this short kind of excursus on principles. So it seems to me, and I'm not a scholar, remotely a scholar of the American Constitution, but you'll recognize the preamble to the US Constitution, which to me begins with one of the most interesting and perhaps the most catastrophic ambiguity of modern political language, and that is "we the people." So how does one understand "we the people"? Does one understand we the collection of enfranchised citizens, we the voters, we the members of this society, or does one understand it as some kind of performance or performative of union in what later would become Lincoln's argument? It seems to me that this ambiguity, this kind of almost collapse of clarity at the beginning of the document of Constitution, in the double sense of the term, as in the sense of a document and in the sense of the constitution of the nation, has potential. It also has catastrophic potential. And the debate that has been raging in the United States now for 40 years on so-called originalism, about the close reading of these kinds of documents, very much in the spirit of the ideology of origins, meaning something that is sacred and mythological rather than human and historical, that in a way there's an enormous compensatory anxiety, if you can call it that, to make up for this kind of ambiguity of language, which, as I say, on the one hand has enormous potential, on the other hand has a kind of catastrophic ambiguity in the sense that it's impossible to know or to provide meaning to something that, in fact, for exactly the purpose that it exists, has no meaning. It seems to me that the French tradition of Le Peuple, which begins exactly in 1789, I'll defer to Daniel, who's an historian of this period, has a much clearer sense of language and history, although it doesn't solve political problems, and that there is a founding text for this language, and that is the famous essay, "What is the Third Estate?" of the Abbé Sieyès of 1789, where he writes in 1789 that there are three estates in France, the clergy and the nobility, and the third estate, everybody else, that everybody else, the third estate, is the people. It is 97% of the population, he says, in 1789, but 100% of the productivity, meaning the agricultural economy and therefore the material existence of the nation. And this position enables the very long, ultimately Marxist interpretation of the French Revolution as the history of the people, re-articulated as the history of social class, in many ways still the dominant argument about the meaning today of 1789 for France. And then other examples, which for this audience I certainly won't spend any time on, is the inscription on the Reichstag, dem deutschen Volke, which has a completely different valence of what the Volk means for the 19th century and the 20th century. Some years ago, I used up my 15 minutes of fame by writing a letter to the New York Times, which was published, comparing this inscription to the Confederate flag. And saying that they shared the same problem of conferring a certain legitimacy on a disappeared 19th century ideology. And I got quite a bit of very angry mail about this, more in defense of the German case than in defense of the American one, although they were American letters. So it seems to me that these national discourses form very powerful bifurcations of this very ambiguous understanding of the people, and then by necessity the ambiguities on the question of the power of the people. So to conclude, just to that's great. I don't need them anymore. I cite a couple of sentences in the book which I I've continued to think about. I have to find them. Sentences written about 20 years ago by another Israeli philosopher, and that is Avishai Margalit. So I should have marked the page, but I failed to do that. Where Margalit distinguishes what he calls thick relations and thin relations. And he writes as follows, just a couple of sentences. He says, thick relations are grounded in attributes such as parent, friend, lover, fellow countryman. Thick relations are anchored in a shared past or moored in shared memory. Thin relations, on the other hand, are backed by the attribute of being human. Thin relations are, in general, our relations to the stranger and the remote. So I'm not sure about his fairly automatic association of thick relations with countrymen. There's a national problem and a gender problem attached to this word, countrymen. But I'm very interested in this category of thin relations. And the question that I'm asking now and that I would like to keep thinking about is whether one can talk about democratic culture, democratic attachment, and even what I'd like to call democratic eros, meaning an attachment to democratic culture that has capacity to involve the unconscious. Whether one can think of these things in terms of thin relations rather than thick relations. Whether the attachment to large groups and the coherence of groups, what one does when one acts politically, for example, in an election, is an attachment to the sense of progress and process rather than an emotional attachment to a sense of deep community or deep history or even deep language. In other words, whether thin relations and the attachment to process can, in fact, form the bonds that are required for a democratic culture to exist. One of the examples that, again, remains in my head is an example of the intense pleasure and meaning that the emigre relatives and friends of my grandparents' generation exercised in the 1950s and 60s when I began to have an inkling of what it meant to participate in anything politically, the pleasure of voting in the United States as recent immigrants who actually didn't speak the language very well at all. And I sometimes accompanied these people just by coincidence as they stood in line waiting to vote. And I experienced way before I had a remote understanding of what it was that they were experiencing, simply the meaning of participating in this kind of process. So there was no sense of nationalism, no sense of national belonging, very limited sense of language, clearly no sharing of any kind of traditional practice or belief in this new society that they were being introduced to, but there was a sense of participating as equals in a political community that somehow was redolent of universal principles and universal law beyond the clear pitfalls of what becomes known as universalism, which is historically quite flawed because universalism is the value that I have and the value that you don't have. I can tell you what it's like to be universal. I can tell you what it's like to be cosmopolitan. Some people have that, other people don't have that. So in fact, there are more divides that keep entering as soon as one, it seems to me, moves into an area of thick relations. So this is where this project is going now. I can talk more about its sources and what it leans on, but I think I'll leave it there. And I'm very glad to take your questions. Thanks.
No, I might sit here and then...
Should I sit here?
Where you like.
Is the camera showing everything? Is he showing? Is it
No,
showing
the
him?
camera would actually show the two of you if you sat together.
Okay, let's
Thank you, Michael. That was fascinating, and it's just as great listening to you as it is reading you. And fascinating to see how a story that is several thousand years old and maybe never actually happened has helped to think our way out of the Trump era, and we can prolong, as you said, out of the European crisis of democracy, of the Israeli crisis of democracy. Maybe to open the discussion, I would like you to speak a little bit more about two different versions of that thinking out of the era that your book offers and that Moses' story offers. And they're maybe mutually exclusive, but maybe not. And this is what I'd like to ask you. On the one hand, the story of Exodus is, of course, the story of a path out of repression. So in this case, the tyrant is the Pharaoh, and the way out is a path of liberation. And then this other reason, other direction that you could read the story in is more Schoenbergian, and you know the opera so well, so much better than I do. And it is a story about not so democratic leadership. It is actually, Moses can be seen as an early version of a populist. But can he be both? I mean, can he be the leader of a path out of tyranny and the early version of a populist? How do you make sense of that tension that is in the figure?
That's a great question. I think it is possibly, even probably, the question that fascinated Freud, and that the question that comes out iconographically in this very strong ambiguity in the posture and in the actual event. In fact, what is happening is Moses becoming a kind of violent tyrant, in other words, about to kill a lot of people and divide the population into true followers and not true followers. Is there a moral judgment made on a group of people who actually belonged in slavery because they were not ready to be, in fact, the writers of their own political constitution? In the U.S. reading of emancipation and in the whole colonial dimension, right, in the global colonial, post-colonial dimension, this idea of not being ready for democracy is a discourse that one hears all the time and has a great deal of power in the racism that followed the emancipation of the American slaves and that came back exactly in the period when the Lincoln Memorial was being prepared with the code word of redemption. So you have the period of Reconstruction, 1865 to 1877. You have the end of Reconstruction, but much less known is this jargon of redemption, which is very active in the first 20 years of the American 20th century, involving the redemption of the true nation. This is exactly the language we hear again now. I mean, the redemption as a word is not that active. There's not a lot of historical knowledge or memory of that period that is in a way useful politically. But this idea of the return of the true nation, which of course claims to be anti-racist but is clearly racist, is very active in American politics now. And a term that has been re-legitimated is Christian nationalism. So the idea that Christian nationalism becomes a legitimate political argument is a very powerful idea. So can one be both or not? I would like to think no. On the other hand, there is another crisis where, again, to go back to the example of Freud's reading of the ambiguity of the Moses statue, where the reclining Moses, who decides to sit down, is not a political actor, not a political agent. So in Hannah Arendt's terminology, you have the contemplative and the active, and there's a great deal of difficulty in putting those two things together.
And in this case, Moses is more of a medium through which godly will is transmitted, and he's not an actor.
Another problem.
Thank you. There are questions. Susan has the first, and I see more in the back.
Thank you, Michael. I especially learned from and appreciated your analysis of the ambivalence in all of those visual images. You pointed out things that were really enlightening for me. My problem is, for my purposes, you left the lecture on a cliffhanger with your remarks about universalism. I was actually struck recently when I was at a Vikos seminar on post-Zionism that, the one word in so many very different kind of circles that you can't say anymore is universalism. I happen to be deeply committed to it. And I just wonder if you could argue a little further, because your claim, I'm universalist and you're not, whatever I think is universal and, whatever you think is not. It's not enough of an argument. I certainly know some of the post-colonial arguments about it, but I just wondered if you could say a little bit more.
So I think there's an easy way to answer, or an easy way out of a good answer, and that's to raise a disciplinary flag. And to say that universalism is a legitimate argument philosophically, but a bad argument historically. So that the historical claims of universalism have, maybe not always, but often, and certainly within several grand traditions, been made according to this argument of, and this is my gloss, I'm universal and you're not. In the same way that cosmopolitanism has often been, especially in Germany, raised as a principle of national cosmopolitanism. In other words, that seems like a contradiction in terms, but historically it's not a contradiction in terms. But the more difficult question, I think, is the extent to which the historical record, as we would want to debate it, impacts or eats into the legitimacy of the categories in general. So I think that when you think of the universal church, right, Catholicism as the principle of the universal, it seems to me, at least historically, a clear example of a universalism that survives up to a certain point and then crashes. And the 19th century German historiographic tradition of dividing the world at the Reformation, it seems to me, still has a great deal of legitimacy. It's an old position which I think historically has come back. So when I was in graduate school, one couldn't talk about the Counter-Reformation. One talked about the Catholic Reformation. Now the Counter-Reformation is back, which seems to me to be politically important. So I think the question does remain to the extent to which the kind of universalisms one would want to adhere to. Human rights is the 20th century answer to the older discourses of universalism and cosmopolitanism. So, and the argument for human rights these arguments are in danger. So I'm not sure what the answer is, but can one preserve the arguments of human rights? I would want to do so, but not evading the examples of history, which include the examples of racism and colonialism and gender politics.
But all those things are, problems that universalism was invented to solve. I mean, if I understand you properly, what you're saying is, well, there is an idea of universalism, but it's never been realized historically. And, even those people who claim to be trying to realize it or push it further were unaware of their own limitations in that regard. But to see racism and sexism as arguments against universalism, it seems to me, is putting the problem backwards. Universalism in an ideal form is exactly invented to do away with racism and sexism and so on. Agreed on that.
I
mean, maybe it is a real
I agree with that.
disciplinary
That's
question,
why,
yeah.
that's why the question is, to what extent is the disciplinary flag the right flag? Because I think today, there are new languages that have their own pitfalls of moving out of the very same universalism that is being claimed. So, for example, I'm always warned against bringing this up in the current climate, but the language of inclusion, to me, is a very problematic language, because the language of inclusion, which is key to the rhetoric, certainly of the American university these days, is a rewrite of the language of toleration. In other words, it's still a discretionary issue as to who the people in power choose to include. It's a very different language from the language of either diversity or representation, which involves, voices coming, from the points of origin, but not in the way that I talked about it before. So it seems to me that inclusion is, in a way, almost a self-deluding language and a self-deluding politics, right? The language of representation, of egalitarianism in some way, I mean, it's certainly the Tocquevillian language of equal conditions, is, I think, a different kind of thing. So the question is action, our action in history capable of bringing these principles into practice? I think that's the question. I think the record is not terribly good. The record is not good.
Well, we can agree on that.
So, and philosophy departments still exist, right?
Yeah, they need to. Yeah, they need to pay more attention to real problems. It seems to me. But thank you. Okay, we can agree
There's
on
a
that.
question further in the back. Yeah.
So I want to go back to the visual, especially to this iconography of being seated.
Oh, great.
And
yeah.
I think it's not only a bodily gesture that is involved in a kind of temple flow that, you have to stand before you get seated, you have to stand up to go away, and so. So it's indeed a kind of, let's say, a frozen moment in a flow. And so the seat, I think it became very clear in the Lincoln case, is definitely, in my view, and also the Michelangelo, a kind of, substitute for a throne. Mm-hmm. So it's an empty seat of power. Mm. And it's interesting that, in the Moses case, the law is already something that is aside. So he is the first representative of the law, but no longer the bringer of the law. So I think that's already a difference. So insofar one could say there is a chain in iconography from, sitting presidents. And so until the metaphor of a sitting president in the American vocabulary. So for me it's interesting to see how representation is sought in this, metaphor of a sitting person who has this moment of power. But you can say, in the Moses case, the populist was Aaron, and not Moses. Moses is a representation of the law, so to say. So I don't know. Maybe one can look at this moment where the chair, to come back to the jokes we heard already, is something you sit on, in a row onto different chairs. And the chair, the one chair that is a throne from which, representation stems, is the one that has to be filled differently. So I don't know, maybe one can look at these representations, the visual representations, already in this model of representation and as a political stand-in, so to say. And this would, I think, already eclipse the problem of the people, the voters, the citizens. So whatever you fill in, it's all culminating in this idea of the chair.
No, I think that's lovely. I'm tempted to work that in to the way the metaphor divides on the one hand into a kind of into transience. Right? So I think when people talk about the sitting president, they mean someone holding office for a very short period of time, right? And therefore giving authority to the process, to being thrown out of office, that nobody occupies the chair. There are laws for how long one can occupy it, et cetera, et cetera. On the other hand,
So the chairs is kind of Platonic idea.
But an idea that is not structural, right? An idea that is about transience. On the other hand, I'm just improvising now, but it seems to me that seat, if it is a throne metaphor, is a kind of repetition of the king's two bodies, right? So that that there is a kind of transience to the person, but there is a permanence to what people have called the imperial presidency. And which is also a political ambiguity that ultimately gives no credit to the process or to the voters.
The sitting president is actually a doubling of the meaning, because president has already the sitting in it, so it is a sitting in this case, which is
presiding. Right.
I wonder if there is an iconography. I just wonder if the iconography could go back even further into Byzantine representations of Jesus, the Pantocrator, sitting Jesus on his. Just a thought.
well,
He thinks the sitting Moses is a Christian Moses.
Have there been Christian Moses?
Okay. They claim it.
Yeah.
Also as their form,
Yeah, I know, but it's pre-Christian, so
And it was to be a part of the tomb of a pope, right? It was part of the tomb of Julius II, which is a lifelong patron of Michelangelo.
Thank you, Michael. I need to kind of think while speaking, so I'm wondering about whether you could say something about the tension or tensions that either you see or that you've encountered in some of the afterlives that you've looked at between this, with the coordinates of the Decalogue, the law. And I know that in the book you refer to the law, you talk about the law and only as the law that was revealed at Sinai, so the Decalogue. But actually the law is ceremonial law, which is exactly that Pauline critiques, right, as a particular, not as a universal. So between the law, however you want to understand it, universalism, that's another sort of coordinate, the articulation of it, which I will now call aesthetic, an aesthetic articulation, right, in the language, in a language that is almost poetic, almost poetry. And perhaps Sinai, Moses at Sinai, Moses the lawgiver, and Moses of the actual Exodus, the moment after the Exodus with the Song at the Sea. So that is also a moment, or the Song of Moses at the end of his life, right? That is, both of them are sort of some sort of form of delivering or mediating the covenant, but really in an almost passive way, sort of, right, mediating the covenant between the people, the however you want to see it, and the divine. So all these, so basically my question is about the tension between the particular and the universal in all these moments of Moses, of Mosesism.
Well, it seems to me that the Decalogue itself is highly varied. In other words, some of them are ceremonial, others are definitely not ceremonial. They're kind of basic anthropological, I mean, in a way equivalents to incest law and other basic formulations of the possibility of forming a society. I think, and this is way beyond my own competence, but the textual history and the moments of writing which are so much later. In other words, writing back moments of origin from a much later point of view complicates the story a lot, and certainly brings in the question of ceremony and the question of a much more formed identity, which involves the presence of the god of Sinai, as my friend from Vico, Konrad Schmidt, who helped me a lot with this, makes very clear that this is not the only god, right? This is in a way not a monotheistic god. This is a very competitive god. It's a god who is saying, this is what I want, and that's what idolatry ultimately is. It's one god against other gods.
The question in the front row.
I seem to remember from art history that in modern Europe, after the Renaissance, the sculptors showed their figures when they were kings or emperors or rulers riding on a horse, standing if they are in charge, like a prime minister, and sitting as philosophers, thinkers, by extension, writers, composers. And you chose exactly the ones, the sedentary ones. That sort of means to me that we're not looking at the other parts of that trilogy of why these figures are shown differently, why other figures are shown in a different way, and I think that's part of the meaning of those sculptures. The second thing is something which is, I wrote a lot of stuff about the Reichstag, and I concluded a whole chapter about the development of that Dem Deutschen Volke. And the people who were watching that develop had a lot of laughs. They made a lot of fun of the suggestions that were being presented. And for 20 years, the emperor prohibited that line from being made, from being composed. So that, and that was a very strange part of it. The person who had to design the letters had to figure out a way that the word Deutsch would not be started with a lowercase d, which would have made it an adjective, but the word Deutsch could not start with a lowercase d. And so Peter Behrens, who did that, figured out a way to make those D's fit in with the other letters, and they're all uppercase.
Which was in the middle of the First World War, quite a bit later from the founding of the building.
Before Christmas, 1916.
16, right?
But it was proposed in 1893.
Right.
Thank you very much. I was very intrigued by the category of historical uselessness, which you started out with. No street names, is that the litmus test? And if so, what would be the antonym? And can it remain so over time?
the antonym of historical uselessness would be usefulness, obviously, but I think I cheated a little bit because what I meant was ideological usefulness and uselessness. In other words, how useful is somebody as a symbol of a kind of fixed ideology or identity, a national identity, a popular identity. And it seems to me that in this case, Moses, unlike David, is not useful. I think the same could be said for Lincoln as well, although he's been fought over. And if you do a kind of micro-history of the Lincoln Memorial, which has been done, because it's such a massively known icon, it is periodized in very interesting ways in the sense of who identifies with that memorial, who uses it. So I don't know if I can get this back. Can I get the image back? I don't know where it is. Yeah, thank you very much. This is an image from 1939, an image of Marian Anderson singing on Easter Sunday in front of the Lincoln Memorial. And the story there is well known. A concert hall had been booked for this concert, and in the fairly last minute, Constitution Hall, the hall, wouldn't allow Anderson to sing in the hall because of Jim Crow laws that were still in effect. It was run by the Daughters of the American Revolution, the DAR, and they wouldn't allow a black person to perform. So the concert was canceled, and then the result was an infinitely larger concert before about 75,000 people, done for the purpose of having all those people, but also for making a point about who does the statue belong to. So it seems to me that this is a moment of a total transformation of meaning of the statue, and a transformation of the meaning of the statue from its original intention, which is national union, with the flaws of, if we go back to the universal problem of who is included in this notion of union, to what I am calling in the book a moment of reconstitution. In other words, where the other meaning of emancipation, equality, of how a black woman is allowed to, in fact, show her voice with the full ambiguity of the term voice, right, as a bodily sound, but as political voice. That's a duality that interests me a great deal. So this is a moment in 1939, which it seems to me completely changes the meaning of this statue. The appropriation of the emancipation message of the statue only lasts until the early 1960s. So Martin Luther King uses it for the famous March on Washington speech, 1963. And then after that, it disappears, and Lincoln becomes very suspect in the ongoing post-civil rights era of racial politics. In between is another image, also a very well-known image. This is the image of the famous morning in Little Rock, Arkansas, in September of 1954. Where 3 years after the Brown versus Board of Education decision mandating the integration of public schools, 9 African-American students were admitted into this high school in Little Rock, and a kind of riot ensued where the National Guard that were officially assigned to protect them, in fact, made sure that they couldn't enter and allowed a white mob to surround them and threaten these students, most of whom were protected by parents and friends, but the person who became the most well-known, a young woman who was 16 years old, named Elizabeth Eckford, because her family didn't have a telephone, didn't understand how this was being arranged, she found herself alone and heckled by this white mob. And the young woman behind her has also become well known, who is cursing at her and yelling at her and pushing her away. So again, with the possible dangers of overreading, but I would defend it, it seems to me that this is again a reversal in 1957 of what Marian Anderson accomplishes in 1939. And what Toni Morrison describes, and it's a line that has been quoted quite often, as the white gaze, the fact that black Americans are constantly under the white gaze. Is what has to be overcome if this icon of Marian Anderson is in fact efficient enough, powerful enough to overcome the other story of the Lincoln Memorial. So that white gaze, which somehow disappears in this photograph, and this is a very carefully constructed photograph, also what is in focus, what is out of focus. Lincoln is somehow in the back but disappearing, and Marian Anderson is in focus. It's a very important photograph. Also the vertical organization, that there's more empty space on the top of the statue, very different from the more well-known one that I showed before. And then you have a return of the white gaze, so to speak, behind the figure of Elizabeth Eckford as an extremely hostile gaze. So there is a very interesting kind of continuity and contradiction in these images that I think play a part in making them famous, but also a very long answer to your interesting question, but that also show how this is a monument that completely changes from, let's say, 20-year period to 20-year period in terms of what it means. And it continues to be the icon in American political statuary, but it changes radically.
Was it Eleanor Roosevelt who organized the Marian Anderson concert?
Apparently not. That's a story, that's a very popular story.
Okay.
She did resign she was a member of the DAR, and she resigned from the DAR as a result of this event, but the fact that she intervened is apparently a myth.
Could it be that what you call uselessness is in reality the reason why the Moses figure is used so broadly?
Or not, right? That this Moses, and certainly this Lincoln as Moses, changes radically as to whether he's useful or not. Is Lincoln useful, and to whom is he useful? Changes radically. Where would Moses be used today? It seems to me the kind of nationalization would be in Israel, and the fact I find it at least interesting evidence. He's not on trial for uselessness, but I think it's at least interesting evidence that, in fact, there's no way to control. There's no way to control the story.
Yes.
There's somebody else. I'll ask another question, actually, continuing the couple of words that you just mentioned, nationalism or nation, and so can I use as an antonym to uselessness utility? Political utility, historical utility. I wonder, I'm just thinking about a few things that you've said, and in light of the very present category of exile in your book, which makes a lot of sense as an existential category, and as also this sort of the state of the it's actually a pre-politics. So everything that's happening in terms of the political constitution happens in exile or diaspora or in the in-betweenness and in nowhereness, right? And I'm just wondering if we compare Moses to King David, and why King David is such a strong, very useful, very sort of great political utility, is because King David already acts and represents a nation, right? A political structure. So a nation state in a way, a theocracy, but still it's a theocracy of a nation. Whereas Moses is pre-nation, is pre-nation in a way, in the political sense. But the political law, in the universalist sense of law, like an order of a society takes place there. And I'm wondering whether you might say something about, or if you can say something about perhaps the inevitable failure of democracy as soon as it becomes, sort of paradoxically, the paradox of democracy, as soon as it is coupled with nationhood, with nation, with nationality, with nationalism. Is it inevitably a story of failure always, democracy? Is it actually more akin to, or should be perhaps, to really be loyal to itself and not to sort of devour itself, more akin to anarchy, to anarchism in a benevolent sense, in a good sense, in the Gustav Landauer sense?
Well, I mean, to go back to this, this phrase of thin relations, if thin relations are viable politically, it's because they're real relations. In other words, there's something coherent, but it doesn't have the coherence of nationalism or of racism, both of which depend on exclusion. Right? The only way to have an in-group is to have a group that is excluded, defined in however, in whatever way one can imagine. But your question about democracy being essentially prone to failure, I think, is a really interesting one. And if you think about exile as a prelude to a political system, the question is, does one think of its development in terms of a future or in terms of a telos? And so the uselessness that I'm talking about is an absence of telos, right? An absence of some kind of goal. So if you think of, to me, the stupidest comment ever made about 1989, right, is this famous remark of Francis Fukuyama about the end of history, which is crazy. And obviously we now know that it was unreasonable. But in other words, does history have a point of arrival? So this is where David is useful, or has been useful, and Moses has not been useful, where Lincoln has been profoundly ambiguous. So in a way, the nationalization is, this is a sloppy analogy, but to go back to the idea of the Christian Moses, is in a way analogous to the telos of Christianization. So the Hebrew Bible makes sense as a prelude to the Christian Bible. Right? Isaiah makes sense as a foreboding of Jesus. Infinite numbers of examples. Or is it history, which has no sense of the future? Only that one hopefully exists, but cannot be written.
Other questions?
One thing to the story, of the Exodus, that there's the element of freedom, of emancipation. That's clear, whatever slaves or what, and the moment of the egalitarianism is in it, and Moses' name is even not determined by anything, universalism, but not democracy. Democracy comes in it only in the moment when the people say no. Beim Murren des Volkes, or in the when they say no with Aaron, or when they can't say no in the contract situation, But these are the only democratic elements in it, I think. But you
Exactly.
could interpret as
It is not a story about democracy.
No,
and it's not. And if one.
Universalism, egalitarianism, these things are all in it. Emancipation.
If one begins the modern Moses moment, for example, with Spinoza, with the Tractatus, where the episode becomes where Spinoza insists that this is his history and not myth, and the history is non-national. It is a political constitution for the moment, which is not eternal, which is not a telos. It is not a democratic system. Absolutely not. So that one must not overread in that sense, and that would be a real error. However, it seems to me that as the structure of the story has so important a self-critical potential. The structure of the biography, no point of origin, no point of ending, the difficulty of speech, the fact that Moses is someone who says that he's a person who cannot speak, to go back to this question of voice. Very rich, very poetically very overdetermined a principle, where then Aaron comes in as the person who can speak, and then in Schoenberg also as the person who can sing. Schoenberg has there are a lot of problems in Schoenberg because it's a very nice example of universalism becoming nationalism. All right, so that if Aaron sings, it's because he sings falsely, he sings Italian opera, where Schoenberg, in his tradition, is radicalizing in the sense of going back to the roots of German music, which only tells the truth. So there's a very interesting complication there, to say nothing of the Weimar translation of the Hebrew Bible, by Martin Buber and Franz Rosenzweig, which was criticized very powerfully by Siegfried Krakauer as being Wagner. This is the language of Wagner. This is where my fence comes back. I think it's an absolutely brilliant criticism. Krakauer even said that the Buber-Rosenzweig Bible should be performed in Bayreuth.
The gentleman in the back.
Thanks, Michael. Very short question about another icon of democracy in America. I have to admit I haven't read your book yet, but do you also deal with Mount Rushmore as a very prominent other icon? Because I was thinking when you showed us that Lincoln became a Moses in a way, he and three of his colleagues also came out to be the mountain. You could argue on which Moses got the tablet. So I don't know what does it mean, and what does it mean that we read a lot about it in Europe here, that Trump and his supporters often meet at Mount Rushmore. What does it mean that the symbol has become such prominent for him and the Republicans?
That's a great question, Robert. The answer is no in the book, but it should be done. It would have to be done through Hitchcock. I mean, you can no longer see Mount Rushmore. I've never been there, but one can no longer think of Mount Rushmore without Hitchcock. And Hitchcock was, whatever he was saying in North by Northwest, he was saying something very important about that kind of national myth in rock, and how you climb around it, so to speak. I mean, it would have to be done that way, I think.
So I'm looking around. Are there further questions? If that is not the case, and also online there are no further questions, I really want to thank you. It was fascinating to think through the present with this old, very, very old narrative. And I think what I personally take away is actually this understanding of Exodus that in the beginning seems frustrating, as it has no telos, as it has no beginning, as it is a process where speech is lost. But the more you were speaking, the more I thought I understood that it was actually this process, ongoing process, that can never reach not only not a nation, not a state, but can never reach a conclusion, never can reach a fulfillment. And in that ongoing nature is actually what could be like a saving force in the struggles that freedom is in today. But this is only my takeaway. I guess you all have others and better ones, and I thank you all for coming. Thank you again for your great discussion.
And I want to thank both of our speakers, Daniel for a really superb introduction, and Michael for rich, fascinating talk. I'd also like to remind you of our next event on this coming Tuesday, 24th of January. Michael Wild will be presenting his new prize-winning book that won. Martin, welcher Preis war das? Was also ein großer Historiker, das war der Historikerpreis, was das Buch gewonnen hatte. Weiß es irgendjemand? Okay. Er war groß. Großer preisgekröntes Buch, was schon angekündigt wurde für November, und ich glaube, er hatte Covid, es war Covid, ist krank geworden, deshalb steht es nicht auf unserem Normalprogramm, aber das wird sicherlich sehr spannend. Sie könnten sich ein Programm nehmen. You can take a program downstairs. We still have a couple of really interesting points in our program. Please join us for a glass of wine, take a program with you, and come back soon. Thank you.